So Sean Roberts is working here at George Washington University. He joined the Elliott School in 2008 as the director of the International Development Studies program. Sean is a cultural anthropologist with extensive applied experience in international development work, having conducted ethnographic field work among the Uyghur people of Central Asia and China during the 1990s. He has published extensively on his community in scholarly journals and collected volumes. And he also produced a documentary film on the community entitled Waiting for Uyghurs Done, which was produced in 1996. In 1998, 2000 and from 2002 to 2006, he worked at the United States Agency for International Development in Central Asia on democracy programs, designing and managing projects in civil society development, political party assistance, community development, independent media strengthening, and elections assistance. From 2006 to 2007 and from 2007 to 2008, during these two academic years, Sean Roberts was a postdoctoral fellow in the Central Asian Affairs at Georgetown University, and at the same time, he continued to work on development projects for a variety of NGOs and served as a senior program officer at the Center for Civil Society and Governments at the Academy for Educational Development, where he managed a peace-building project in Darfur in Sudan and an anti-corruption project in Moldova. And Sean today is going to talk about secular and religious modernities in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Thank you.
So I'm going to take a slightly different tact. I'm going to look at the tensions between secular and religious modernities in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region historically. Partially because I think that tells us a lot about the present in the region. But first, just to contextualize this talk with the former two presentations, it's important to look at the uniqueness of the Chinese case. Obviously, China is not a Muslim majority country, so it's very different than the Middle East countries we're talking about and than the Central Asian countries. Its Muslim minority is substantial in numbers, but not percentage-wise. I mean, if we even look at it in comparison to Russia, Russia has almost 12% Muslim population, and there's only 1.8% Muslim population in China. Another difference that I think is important is that the ideology of atheism is still somewhat alive in China, despite its economic liberalism and a certain amount of religious liberalism. The state is still run by the Communist Party, which embraces an ideology of atheism. So just to start with the present situation, in the last 20 years, there's been an increased conflict between Uyghurs, the main population in the Xinjiang region, and the Chinese state. And much of this conflict has become violent, in particular in recent years. And although this conflict is related to a number of different issues, it's increasingly being expressed through the People's Republic of China's promotion of atheism, or at least a very stringent idea of religious observation, and the Uyghurs' religiosity. And these two things are coming into conflict. And one of the points I want to make in my talk is the intensity of this conflict, especially in comparison with the former Soviet Central Asian states, is largely due to the fact that the People's Republic is really only now able to exert its power in the region of Xinjiang to a large degree and really try to forcibly integrate Uyghurs into a state culture, which has some very atheist dimensions. So, first of all, I think if we're talking about state, secularism, and religion, it's unavoidable to also talk about modernism. There's many different narratives about modernism in Islam. There's a very popular kind of narrative that's very similar to the one discussed about secularism in Islam, that modernism and Islam are not compatible. But of course, there's been a lot of modernist movements in Islam. And in Central Asia, including in the province of Xinjiang, the narrative about Islamic modernization has very much been related to this idea that the Islamic world had been at the forefront of civilization and advances in science and math and so on in the 9th to 16th centuries, and by the 16th century it began to wane in its power globally. And modernism as an ideology is very much associated with Western domination of the world in the 18th and 19th centuries. But there, in Central Asia in particular, a certain form of Islamic modernism emerges in the 19th century as a response to this global shift and an attempt to recapture the glory of Islamic civilization. Now, I put up this map because I think it's really important when we're talking about the Xinjiang region of China to think about the region that was conceptualized in the 19th century as Turkestan. So this is roughly the borders of Xinjiang today, and this was dominated by the Qing Empire of China in the 19th century. And across the border, we have the dominance of the Russian Empire and the Central Asian states. But there was a lot of shared interaction across these borders and a lot of common events that they shared. Now, in 19th century Turkestan, Islamic modernism was generally identified with a movement known as Jadidism, which was an educational reform movement, and it was very much based on the idea of taking the best of Western education and bringing it into Islamic schools, but not changing those schools so they were exclusively secular schools. It was still very much a Muslim ideal, and the schools also taught theology and Islamic morality issues and practices. But also this movement, it's somewhat broad in its application by scholars when they talk about Jadidism. It tends to encompass a lot of different movements that were around during this time. And most of them were anti-colonial and nationalist in character, but they weren't any specific nationalism. So you see in a lot of Russian sources, for example, associating Jadidism with Pan-Turkism. Among those people who were interested in Jadid schools and Islamic modernism in general at that time, you had parochial nationalists who were interested in ethnic nationalism, you had Pan-Islamicists, and you had Pan-Turkists. But all of them were very much modernist in their outlook. They were interested in the idea of the modern state. And Jadidism had its origins largely in the Tatar population of the Volga and Crimea region of the Russian Empire. But at this time, Uyghurs in East Turkestan, or Chinese Turkestan, had close relations with the Muslims of the Russian Empire. And in particular, the merchant class did a lot of trading across the border and came into contact with the ideas that were very popular in the Tatar elite at this time. And in East Turkestan, the first major supporters of Jadidism were members of a wealthy merchant family from the southern oasis of Artush, known as the Musabai family, which opened schools, and they also brought back teachers and materials from Tatar areas of the Russian Empire, as well as from Turkey in the late 19th century. And they established the first schools in about 1885, first in their hometown, and then in an area of Xinjiang that's close to the Kazakhstan border in the city of Kulja. And here's a picture of the Musabai brothers from the early 20th century. And I put in parentheses Musabayev because the family, or members of the family, adopted the Russian ending to their last name as kind of a sign of their modernization inclination. So I think some of the major impacts of Jadidism in Xinjiang are very much still apparent in the region. It fostered a modernist ideal of Islam that allowed Uyghurs to engage the Chinese Empire's development on their own terms. It fostered a vision of a modern Uyghur state that could be still Islamic in nature. And it cultivated a new Uyghur elite, both fluent in Islam and Western modernist educational ideas and ideologies. Now, what happens across the border in Central Asia in the early 20th century is Bolshevism is introduced to a lot of the supporters of Jadidism in Central Asia. And particularly in the Uyghur community, which kind of crossed the border, there was hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs on the Russian side of the border. A lot of them they were recruited by the Bolsheviks, and they became supporters of the Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks in Central Asia at that time were really promoting the revolution as an anti-colonial revolution. And a lot of these former Jadidists became Communist Party members, leaders in the communist movement, until about the 1930s when most of them were purged. And after that point, Jadidism was generally portrayed as a reactionary ideology in the Soviet Union. And here's just a picture of, it's not a very good resolution picture, but a group of Uyghur former Jadidists, then Bolsheviks, all of whom were eventually purged and executed in the 1930s. So what happened in China during this time? You didn't have the same situation, and Jadidism, at least the spirit of it, the idea of Islamic modernism, continued to be influential in the region. And this even happened as the Soviet Union became increasingly influential in the region. You could make the argument during the 1920s and 1930s that the Soviet Union was generally more influential in Xinjiang than the Chinese Republican state. There were local leaders associated with the Chinese government, but some of them actually became members of the Soviet Communist Party. And they were often taking directions from Moscow more than from Nanjing. But what's interesting is the Soviets during this time did very much the same thing that the Bolsheviks did in Central Asia during the revolutions and Civil War. They promoted a socialist version of modernism, but they did not attack religion, and they did not promote the idea of atheism. So they cultivated supporters among Islamic modernists in Xinjiang at this time. And this is important because there's two major events in the 20th century that are in the historical imagination of Uyghurs to this day, and there are two short-lived independent states that were established in Xinjiang. One in 1933-34, and one in between 44 and 49. They were not encompassing the entire region, they were just encompassing certain areas of Xinjiang, but they were both called the Eastern Turkestan Republic. So they're often referred to as the ETR-1 and ETR-2. The first ETR was very short-lived, about a year, and it's often portrayed by scholars as being more Islamic in character, and often some people describe it as an Islamic state. But subsequent research has shown that actually the Islamic modernist trend was very apparent in this state as well, and it had a very diverse view of the relationship between religion and the state. Interestingly enough, the Soviet Union helped the local Chinese officials retake that region and suppress that state very quickly in 1934. However, the second ETR was actually aided by the Soviet Union, if not in many ways propelled by it. It would be an interesting comparison with the Donetsk People's Republic, actually. The Eastern Turkestan Republic that took over in the north of Xinjiang in 1944 and lasted for 5 years until the Chinese communists came to power, was very much, here's the first ETR, if you have you can see that it's traditionally, at least visually, looks more Muslim than the second ETR, where it's very evident Soviet dress and Soviet influence. But the second ETR was very Soviet in character. It was funded largely by the Soviet Union. And it definitely had socialist values, but it was not atheist at all. In fact, the first president was a former imam who happened to be from Uzbekistan, which is curious. But it was very much connected to the Soviet Union, but again, you did not have this forcible idea of atheism injected into it. So what happens in 1949? The leaders of that second ETR were sent to Beijing to negotiate with Mao in terms of the future of the state, and they were all killed in an alleged plane crash, which many Uyghurs are very suspicious about what happened in that crash. But what the result was that immediately the Chinese Communist Party came to the forefront in the region and took over control. And many of the former ETR officials, many of whom were religious, became members of the Chinese Communist Party and became officials in the new government. And this was not a problem in the initial years of the People's Republic of China, but by 1956-57, you started to have an injection of atheist ideology into the state through the anti-rightist campaign, which purged many of these former Islamic modernists, former ETR officials from the state. And through the 1950s and early 60s, many of the more religious Uyghurs were punished by the state for their views. Now, the Cultural Revolution is the next stage of what happens in the region. And in the Cultural Revolution, I mean, many people associate the Cultural Revolution with very harsh anti-religious campaigns. But in Xinjiang, this was a region that was very far from Beijing. And essentially the state was in complete chaos during the Cultural Revolution. And really the political debates that were ongoing in Xinjiang at this time were between rival parties of Han Chinese, all of whom were trying to claim the right to speak the truth of the revolution and to support the Maoist ideology. And as they were infighting, you did not have really serious anti-religious campaigns being produced through the Uyghur population. You had many Uyghurs who were subjected to harsh conditions on collective work farms, but there was no state campaign of atheism per se that was affecting them. So this brings us to the Reform period, the end of the Cultural Revolution, and Deng Xiaoping coming to power in China. And during this time, you had an reawakening of religious liberalism, and in Xinjiang, a significant reawakening of Islam. But as I was trying to show earlier, through all these other periods, Islam never really disappeared. And it wasn't even that diluted as was the case, let's say, in the former Soviet Central Asian republics. Because the state really didn't have the power during any of that period of time from 1949 on to really try to integrate Uyghurs into a Chinese state. So during the Reform period, you have a proliferation of new mosques, religious schools, you have new literature produced in Uyghur on Islamic themes. And this was not only tolerated, but to a certain degree promoted by the state as an idea of increased liberalism. And you had a lot of Uyghurs studying in Islamic states in the Middle East, studying religion, and that was not only promoted, but supported by state funds at various times. But since 1989, there's been a backlash against that. And this is really where you're starting to see a confrontation between the promotion of a very authoritarian secularism, if not an atheism, in Xinjiang by the state. And I bring up the date 1989 because this, of course, was the time of the Tiananmen square protests that were cracked down on. It was also shortly before the fall of the Soviet Union, which also created more concerns in the Chinese government concerning Uyghurs, because there was worries that the proliferation of independent states in Central Asia would spread into China. And also you had increasing dissent among Uyghurs in China unsatisfied with Chinese rule. So all of these things led to a gradual renewal of Chinese efforts to curtail Islamic religious practices. And this gradual curtailment of religious practices has had frequent bursts of severe repression. And today, we're in a situation where there's more or less a full assault on Islam in the region. Over the last 2 decades, China has increasingly integrated Xinjiang into the People's Republic of China. There's been massive development in the region. There are more Han Chinese migrants coming to the region. And there's various measures being used to assimilate Uyghurs into PRC culture. At the same time, the Chinese government has very much associated Islam among Uyghurs with dissent, and hence terrorism. So they feel that the way to address dissent is to get the region cleansed of Islam. And just to give you an idea of some of the things that have been coming out just this past year in terms of this, there's been several laws passed. I'm not going to go into detail, but for those of you who follow this region, you're probably aware of some of the things that have been not only focused on controlling religion, let's say as in Russia or Central Asia, but have been focused on really changing behaviors of Uyghurs. So, for example, there's a law now preventing religious clerics from performing the nikah marriage. And this is a propaganda poster that won a contest among students, where it's showing a good integrated Uyghur holding up the law of the People's Republic of China prohibiting this, and you have the mother of the either the bride or the groom looking out the window for police. Similarly here, there's been lots of restrictions. A lot of them are very localized because there's not really a law banning Islamic dress, but there's a campaign to beautify the clothing of Muslims in Xinjiang. And that's being interpreted in different ways in different locales. So here you have the conservative Islamic dress associated with evil, I assume, and the good integrated Uyghur in more modest dress, reading about the campaign to beautify clothing in Xinjiang. And also, this is something that has been happening for quite some time, I think since about 1999, or maybe 2000 actually, there's been a prohibition on children under 18 attending mosques in Xinjiang. And this is, again, kind of showing somebody who is trying to be coerced to bring their child to mosque and doing the right thing and bringing him to school instead. But this has been accompanied with a lot of efforts, particularly among youth, to change Islamic behaviors. Teaching that Islam is backward and destructive in schools, and also controlling the clergy in terms of official statements at mosques and so on. So I'll leave it there. One more picture, which I like this one in particular because, yes, religious information passed by very suspicious-looking Muslim women that look like they might be fighting for ISIS, and passing it with DVDs that are illegally produced in homes and so on. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Well, thank you to all of you for these three presentations. I'm pretty sure that this will raise a lot of questions. So we'll have only 25 minutes of discussion, so I will open the floor immediately. David, yes. Could you just identify yourself?
Yes, I'm David Abramson. I'm an analyst on Central Asia at the State Department. And I want to pose a question that takes advantage of the comparative strengths of this panel. So in Central Asia, state control of Islam is often seen as a Soviet socialist legacy of suspicion of religion. But as we saw across the panel, it has at least as much to do or more to do with authoritarian states' efforts to control society, not just religion, but society in general. So building on Alexei's comment about Russia appearing to be less secular than Central Asia because of the role of the Orthodox Church, I was wondering if you could, any of you could comment on what the role of, in terms of what's, the differences between the former Soviet space or Central Asia and the Middle East in terms of how control of religion actually functions, because there seem to be a lot of similarities. One difference is perhaps the level of knowledge or education about Islam in the former Soviet Union, because it was suppressed for so long. And by that I mean more the degree of consensus about religion and role of religious knowledge and institutions in state and society. So what is, how does that role, that level of that consensus playing different roles in the Middle East versus Russia versus Central Asia affect efforts to control it? Is that clear?
Okay, wants to.
So it's clear.
Make it clearer?
Yeah.
So you said Russia seems to be less secular than Central Asia because the Russian Orthodox Church plays a larger role in the state. And from a perspective of a regime, when you have a more educated ulama or religious community, how does that affect the way the state tries to assert its control? And I'd be interested in the Middle East examples too.
A couple of words. If we compare what we have in the Middle East and on the post-Soviet space, on the post-Soviet space in Central Asia, as you know, of course, there are authoritarian regimes post-Soviet or Soviet equality. So there is a total control on religion. They attempt to do it. With exception of Tajikistan, but it's a special case because of civil war. We have no organizations like, for instance, the Muslim Brothers. We have no organization religious, who are able to whom is permitted to participate in the elections. So it's a typical Soviet post-Soviet, I would say. And so this is a difference. This is a difference. I don't know what we'll have in the future, indeed. But I think that actual ruling elite, they will do their best to keep post-Soviet secular regimes everywhere. Otherwise, they could lose the control, and they understand it. In particular, in Uzbekistan. All the time when they talk in Uzbekistan about Islamic threat, they point out to Tajikistan, civil war, and so on. About education, you mentioned the problem of education. Well, I'm skeptic about it. Because indeed, if we talk about real religious Islamic education, you have to learn, you have to know a lot of things concerning Islam. And for Central Asians, for Russia, it's dangerous. Because in that case, you have to study, Wahhabism, means, what does it mean, Salafiyya? Yes? So that's why they speak a lot about necessity to establish a normal, real religious education. But when they talk about it, they think that this education will be born by so-called a traditional Islam, Sunni Islam, and some Shafi'i or Hanafi Mazhab. So that's all. As to the rest, well, it comes from abroad, and we don't need it. That's why, if you, they say that the real danger comes from people who graduated Al-Azhar, some institutions, some in Saudi Arabia, and so on.
Well, if this doesn't speak directly to your question, ask me and I'll try and clarify. But I think there's nothing really difficult to fathom here in terms of what's going on. It really is a very old historical process that other countries and states have performed in the past in the case of Europe. And we're seeing this playing itself out in the case of the Middle East. It's a game of power dynamics, how to retain power, perpetuate power, and how to diminish and try and deflect threats that are coming against ruling elites and ruling families. In the case of most Middle Eastern societies, at least up until the Arab Spring, the basic threat was coming from religious-based opposition groups who were critical of the state, claiming that the state was unethical, immoral, was adopting policies that were alien, and were responsible for the myriad of growing problems that developing societies were facing, increasingly more so as time went forward. So the natural reflex of these ruling regimes to stay in power is to say, wait a second, you know, we're not unethical, we're not un-Islamic, in fact we are very Islamic. And so there was a gradual process, at least within the Republican regimes in the Arab world, to try and slowly promote some sort of state-sanctioned Islamization of society. And the goal there, and the motive, was because of the dynamics between state and society and the perceived threat to the legitimacy of the regime coming from a religious-based opposition, forcing the ruling regimes to increase their, cosmetic Islamic legitimacy. And it all revolves around the same set of calculations. How do you preserve and perpetuate power? I would argue, for example, had the situation been different, let's say if the opposition was coming from some sort of socialist or Marxist set of groups, criticizing the regime for not distributing the wealth, not being ethical, they would have responded in a way that would have claimed that, look, we are egalitarians and we're distributing the wealth. And so that's the dynamic that perpetuates this sort of cycle. How can we get out of it? Is a big question. I don't think there's any easy or quick solutions, but I think that's really the dynamic that's taking place. And it stems from the crisis of legitimacy. It stems from just the broken politics of the Middle East, the perpetuation of these authoritarian regimes who want to stay in power and will do anything necessary to stay in power if it means claiming to be Islamic, claiming to be religious. And the example that I cited of General Assisi is very revealing. He has used religion, manipulated it much more than Mohammed Morsi did, surrounded himself with clerics. When it came to the crackdown, bringing religious scholars to justify the crackdown and saying this is all Islamically ethical because the other side is evil and dehumanizing them. And that's the way politics sort of recycles and perpetuates itself.
Sure.
I was just going to add, I think another thing that's common across all the examples is that if you look at secularism from a different perspective as not being devoid of religion but allowing for multiple religious beliefs, it seems that all of these authoritarian states want to control one vision of religion because allowing for other visions is unpredictable. It's allowing people to have other allegiances. So in the case of, the Russian Orthodox Church, they have a strong alliance with the government. The government's not scared of them. They have a copacetic relationship, and as long as they stay to that belief, then I think they're going to be supportive of it. Because you know, I think even in China, there's not a tendency to obliterate Islam, but there's a tendency to try to have one controlled Islam that's very narrow, and doesn't bleed into things even like weddings.
Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Please let me introduce myself. My name is Xiazhuang. I came from Xinjiang Academy of Governors. I was born and raised in Xinjiang. So, Mr. Robles, today maybe I will ask you a question. I think maybe not a good news for you. Frankly, I couldn't agree with your point. I know in nowadays maybe we have some problems in Xinjiang region, but I think it's not a conflict of the Islamism between with I'm sorry, I'm little nervous. ISISism. Why? I don't understand. When you mention China, you mention Xinjiang, you take a blind eye to the terrorism and extremism. I think if we want to do some useful research, we must stand in a fair and exact standpoint. I think that's important. I think your presentation is imaginable because the cartoons, for me, I have lived in Xinjiang for 40 years, but that's the first time I see the cartoons. I have done some research about the religion problem of Xinjiang. But frankly, I must say this is the first time I see the cartoon. So I don't know how you get them. So maybe this is a workshop. You can express your opinion freely. But I think today you give us the conclusion based on your personal experience and some maybe full history and facts. So I hope we have chance to communicate.
Yes, Sean, you want to?
No, it absolutely is my own opinion. I got the cartoons from a recent BBC report.
Let me ask you. In the 60s, Soviet Union supported Xinjiang separatism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Yes.
But did Soviets use Islam as a political tool?
They used, I mean, they didn't in the 60s, right?
Yes.
In the 60s, they used it to a certain degree. I mean, they used the Second Eastern Turkestan Republic. And they used people from the Second Eastern Turkestan Republic who had emigrated to the Soviet Union, and they put them on the radio and said they were going to return and start a revolution again. But it wasn't really supported with any weapons or anything. It was more propaganda messaging.
Okay, I'm sorry, we only have 10 minutes left, so if you agree, we will gather several questions. We'll start with Navbaho, with this lady there, and I will ask a question. I have one. So Navbaho, yeah.
I'm Navbaho Imamova from Uzbekistan. I work for the Voice of America. I have questions to all three of them. My first question to you, how would you define political Islam today? Because there seems to be so much discussion about what it is, of course depending on the region, but just in general, politically speaking. To Alexei Malashenko, how do you see the reintroduction of Muhammad Yusuf Muhammad Sadiq back in Tashkent? I'm sure you know that he's running his online network now with multiple Islamic websites, and he still has a huge following. To Sean Roberts, how fearful is China of the Islamic interaction between those Muslims in Central Asia and those in Xinjiang?
Yes.
Yes, I'm Marina Van Institute for Global Engagement. I have a question for Alexei. The Muslim communities you mentioned in the Ural Mountains of the Volga River in Siberia, who are these people? Are they predominantly labor migrants from Central Asia? Are they predominantly Muslim ethnicities like Tatars, or are they ethnic Russians who are converting to Islam? Thank you.
I'm Henrik Krzyzewski. I'm with the Uyghur Human Rights Project, and this is for sure. So China portrays a lot of illegal religious activities among Uyghurs as overseas and spying. So I was just wondering about how does that help or not help China control Islam in Xinjiang?
Okay, thank you. And I have a question which actually follows up a little bit with what Bahar was asking about, I mean, the definition of words of political Islam. I have a question to Nadir. You mentioned that some Muslims calls for Sharia, but actually there are many ways to view Sharia or to define Sharia. For example, if we see in Central Asia, according to the very rare surveys we have, I mean, people supporting the Sharia actually are more supporting the Sharia courts or supporting some more, I would say, religious rules in politics, but most of them at the same time would be against the corporal punishments and strongly condemn what happened, for example, in some Muslim countries which are strictly applying the Sharia, or even some of, a lot of them would be actually against polygamy. I mean, the support of Sharia in Central Asia is more actually a way to criticize the government. It's a way to hope for more social justice. And it's most of the time much more a way, how to say, to fight corruption much more than a real willingness to have to apply all the Islamic rules in the daily life. So how is Sharia defined? And actually, I could extend the question to Alexei and maybe even to Sean, if they have some information about how the concept of Sharia is discussed in the Islamic groups, Islamist groups, or even among Muslims in Russia or in Xinjiang. Thank you. So if you have time to respond to all of these questions in something like 7 minutes, that would be
very, very quickly, political Islam is simply the attempt to bring in religious ideas into the political sphere. And there are many different faces of political Islam: nonviolent, democratic, moderate, and extremist. I mean, so it depends on what you mean by political Islam. With respect to your question, Sebastian, in Sharia, generally speaking, what you just described is very similar to what has happened in Middle Eastern societies over the last 40 or 50 years with respect to the rise of the popularity of Sharia. Its rise is in direct proportion to the perceived failure of the state and the failure of state authorities to administer justice equitably. And so there's the sense that, look, the state is controlled by these ruling elites. If you have contacts with the ruling family, you get a different standard of justice. So we're looking for an alternative paradigm. And the alternative paradigm comes back from a certain traditional conception and also a romanticized conception of Sharia being some sort of egalitarian, perfect sort of thing that existed in the past. In terms of how it would work in a modern society, those details haven't been worked out. So the impetus and the desire, I think, is happening within that political context of failed, discredited, illegitimate regimes, and then people responding to the crisis of politics by falling back on a certain religious sort of paradigm that they have romanticized in their own view, and they think that if Sharia values can come into play, then it would be a different state of affairs. But if the example of the Islamic Republic of Iran has taught us anything, it's that is a romanticized idea. When people come to political power, they tend to behave in a very similar way, regardless if they're secular or religious.
Well, a couple of some words about political Islam. Political Islam. Putin, our dear president, he recognized that political Islam may be positive. It's a discovery.
He said that publicly?
I'm sorry?
He said it publicly?
Yeah. He said it. He said it not last year, but before last year.
Yeah, but in what context, though, is he praising?
It was his. He participated in the Council of Muftis of just some. It was a religious meeting.
Yeah.
And he said.
What did he mean by political?
I'm sorry. That was his some meeting with key muftis of Russia. If you want me to explain so what he wanted, I don't know. But it seems that he began to understand something, that Islam is not a very simple thing. It's much more complicated. So that's why somebody, it seems, gave him advice to be more careful and not to consider all Islamic opposition as gangsters and bandits and so on. So that's why, but it's some remark. About Sadiq Muhammad Yusuf. Well, I don't know, but he participated, he participates in all Muslim Russian Congress. All the time he says that Islam is religion of peace and everybody uphold. That's so he became too loyal to all kind of administrations. And he is very respected in Russia, so by the way. Marina, about your question, predominantly, some you asked, who is? All of them. It depends. Could be and Tajik, and Uzbek, and Caucasians, and people from Azerbaijan, and Russians. We don't know how many Russian Muslims we have, but it's about 10,000. And some of them, in particular, in some northern Russian territories, occupy the positions of imams. Maybe 10, maybe 5, I don't know. But indeed, I met with some of them. They are some real Muslims, that's no doubt. And Shariat, your question about Shariat, I don't know, because we can discuss this problem. Two positions. Is Shariat compatible with some Russian constitution and law or not? So that's all. And in the frames of some of these two positions, we may discuss it till the end.
So, first question on Central Asian Muslim connections with Xinjiang and whether that's of concern to the Chinese state. I don't think it is as much as it was. In the 1990s, it was a major concern because you had a lot of these Uyghurs in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan in particular who had been used by the Soviet state, as Alexei mentioned, to promote separatism in China previously. And they in the 90s, frankly, the Central Asian states were very tolerant of some of these groups producing a lot of political information. And that was more of a worry that was not really related to Islam at all. It was related to political issues. And you know, since 99, I'd say since the establishment of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there's very good security relations between Chinese government and the various Central Asian states on this issue in particular. So they have a strong control over the degree to which Uyghurs from China interact with Muslims in the former Soviet Union. And related to that, Henrik's question about how the externalization of Muslim influences is it serving the goals of the Chinese state or not? It kind of depends on what those goals are. I agree with the person who spoke before from Xinjiang that the conflict itself is not about Islam. And in some ways, by talking about it as being about terrorism is maybe ignoring a lot of the problems that are really causing the conflict. And so it doesn't serve them in that way. However, if you externalize bad Muslims versus good Muslims who are local, you know, that serves to try to keep on keeping people away from the bad Islam if you're able to succeed in casting it as being a foreign influence, just as somebody else was saying about the externalization of those threats.
Okay, thank you. We're right on time. So please join me to thank our wonderful presenters today for the great discussion.